They wore silk robes that rustled like whispered secrets in cold palace corridors. They were fed exquisite food, bathed in perfumed water, and housed behind walls that most people in the empire would never see from the inside. From the outside, it might have looked like privilege. It might have looked like fortune. But behind those lacquered gates, behind those carefully painted faces and silk-draped chambers, there existed a life so controlled, so consumed, so utterly stripped of autonomy that survival itself became a performance. A relentless, exhausting, potentially fatal performance. Tonight, we descend into a forgotten corner of one of history's most layered civilizations. We are going to talk about the men, the beautiful, the talented, the unfortunate, who were drawn into the orbit of imperial and aristocratic desire in ancient China. Not as warriors, not as scholars, not as officials, but as companions, as objects, as property wrapped in the language of affection. This is Grimoryx, and what we uncover tonight has been buried under centuries of deliberate silence. If what you've just heard already disturbs you, good, that means you're paying attention. Subscribe to Grimoryx now before we go deeper. This channel exists for those who refuse to let history sanitize itself, those who understand that the most important truths are the ones that were never supposed to be told. Subscribe. Join us in the dark. And if this grips you, leave a like. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Share this with someone who thinks they know everything about ancient history. They don't, not yet. To understand how men came to occupy the role of concubine in ancient China, we must first understand the world they were born into. The imperial court was not simply a place of governance. It was an ecosystem, alive, hungry, and deeply hierarchical. Power was not just political. It was physical, it was intimate. It was expressed in who had access to the emperor's body, to the emperor's attention, to the emperor's favor. We know that female concubinage was a formalized institution in ancient China, structured, ranked, and regulated by law. What is less discussed, far less documented, and deliberately harder to trace is the parallel world that existed alongside it. The world of male favorites, male companions. Men who were selected, cultivated, and in many cases permanently altered to serve the pleasures, the loneliness, or the political appetites of those who held absolute power. The historical record uses careful language. The term Chongnai, sometimes translated as male favorite or beloved subordinate, appears across multiple dynasties. The Han Dynasty texts speak of emperors whose affections were not confined to the women behind palace walls. Emperor Ai of Han, reigning in the 1st century BCE, was said to be so deeply attached to his male companion Dong Xian that he reportedly offered to abdicate the throne in his favor. Ancient sources describe him cutting the sleeve of his robe, rather than wake the sleeping Dong Xian who had drifted off on it. That single image, an emperor choosing tenderness over convenience, gave rise to a term that echoed through Chinese literary culture for centuries. Duingxiu, the cut sleeve, a metaphor for love between men, but poetry and metaphor are not the whole story. They never are. For every Dong Xian who rose to astonishing wealth and power, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of men and boys whose entry into the world of imperial and aristocratic favor was not a romantic story. It was a sentence. Let us begin with how they entered this world. Because the path in was rarely chosen, many were sent, some were purchased. Others were offered as tribute gifts from provinces, from vassal states, from families desperate to curry favor with those who had the power to destroy them. A beautiful son could be a bargaining chip. A boy with musical talent, with a pleasing face, with physical grace, could be surrendered by a family that understood this was the price of survival. Or ambition, often both. The Chinese palace system maintained, at various periods, categories of male attendants whose roles blurred continuously between servant, entertainer, and intimate companion. In the inner courts, those spaces reserved for the emperor and his household, The presence of ordinary men was deeply restricted. The logic, of course, was the protection of the imperial bloodline. No man could be permitted to be alone with imperial consorts. And so eunuchs filled the gap, castrated men who lived their entire lives within the walls, serving in roles of extraordinary intimacy and proximity to power. But eunuchs were a category unto themselves, and we will return to them. Because beyond the eunuchs, there existed another class, less formally defined, more deliberately obscured, of men who served in roles we might now recognize as deeply exploitative. Young men, often of exceptional beauty or artistic ability, who were kept, who were maintained, whose sole function was to be desirable, available, and entirely without the power to refuse. The documentary silence around these men is itself a form of evidence. Confucian orthodoxy, the dominant moral framework for much of Chinese imperial history, was deeply uncomfortable with male desire between men of unequal status, particularly when it implicated the emperor or high-ranking officials. Scribes were cautious. Historians were selective. Official records described relationships in the language of loyalty, of affection, of meritorious service. The physical reality of what many of these relationships entailed was left to inference, to literary allusion, to the gaps between carefully chosen words. Still watching, if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Grimoryx exists precisely for truths like this, the ones history tried to fold away and forget. Subscribe now, you belong here. Now, what was life actually like? What did it mean day to day to exist as a male favorite within a palace or aristocratic household in ancient China? The answer is threefold. It meant extraordinary luxury, extraordinary restriction, and extraordinary danger. The luxury is the part that gets remembered. It is the part that was meant to justify everything else. A male favorite of the emperor could expect lavish clothing, rare foods, gifts of land and titles, access to cultural and artistic education of the highest order. Some received official positions, largely ceremonial, largely designed to give the relationship a veneer of political legitimacy. Dongxian, the beloved of Emperor Ai, was elevated to a rank that shocked the entire court. He was barely 20 years old, with no military achievement, no scholarly distinction, no hereditary claim to anything. He had one qualification. He was wanted, but the luxury was conditional, utterly, completely conditional. It lasted precisely as long as desire lasted. And in a world governed by absolute power, desire was the most unstable currency imaginable. Male favorites lived in a state of permanent atmospheric tension. They understood, even if it was never spoken aloud, that their position was not real in any durable sense. It was borrowed. It was leased from the whim of someone who could revoke it at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. A cooling of affection, a new arrival, a political shift within the court, any of these could end not just the comfortable life but the life itself. The palace was a place of surveillance. Everything was watched. Every interaction with another courtier, every glance, every moment of privacy was subject to interpretation. A male favorite had to navigate an extraordinarily complex web of jealousy. From the emperor's other favorites, from female consorts who saw their own influence threatened, from court officials who found the entire arrangement morally repugnant, politically dangerous, or simply an obstacle to their own ambitions. To survive in this environment required a form of constant, exhausting emotional intelligence, reading moods, anticipating shifts, being present without demanding attention, visible without being threatening, and the physical dimension of this life must not be softened. These men and boys did not have the ability to decline. That is the central, uncomfortable fact. The language of voluntary affection, the cut sleeves, the shared poetry, the legendary devotion, coexisted with a structural reality in which refusal was simply not a viable option. A servant cannot refuse the master. A gift cannot choose its recipient. A man held within palace walls with no family to return to, no position outside of this relationship, no exit that did not spell his ruin, he was not free. His compliance was not consent in any meaningful modern sense. It was survival calculus. The physical alterations imposed on those who entered imperial service, as eunuchs represent one of the most visceral expressions of this system's cruelty. The operation of castration, referred to formally as gong xing or palace punishment, was performed on boys as young as 8 or 10 years old, sometimes younger. The procedure was brutal. It was performed with a knife in conditions that ranged from rudimentary to deeply unsanitary. Mortality rates were significant. Some estimates from later historical periods suggest that 1 in 10 boys did not survive the procedure. Those who did faced a lifetime of physical consequences, altered development, joint pain, temperature dysregulation, social stigma, all in exchange for the dubious privilege of proximity to power. The eunuchs are in many ways the most formally documented of the palace's male captives. They appear extensively in official records because they were legally and institutionally a recognized category. The Ministry of Internal Affairs tracked them. The Bureau of Rights governed their conduct. They were counted, classified, and carefully managed. And yet, even with all this documentation, the personal suffering embedded in their lives is almost impossible to fully excavate. We see them in records as functionaries. We rarely hear them as human beings. What we do know is this: the path into eunuch service was most often poverty. Families who could not feed their children, who needed money, who had been told that a son given to palace service might one day support them, these were the families who handed their boys over. Some boys were taken rather than given. Some were deceived. Some were simply too young to understand what was happening to them until it was already done. And once done, it could not be undone. The body remembered. The body bore the evidence of what had been taken from it, for every remaining year of a life that was no longer entirely one's own. Beyond the eunuchs and the formal favorites, there existed what we might call a gray zone. Men and boys whose relationships with powerful patrons occupied an ambiguous, unwritten, deeply uncomfortable space. In aristocratic households outside the palace, wealthy men kept retinues of young male attendants whose duties were rarely defined with precision. They were companions, they played music, they recited poetry. They accompanied their patrons on journeys, sat beside them at banquets, remained in their chambers until dismissed. The line between service and something more intimate was, by design, never drawn clearly. That ambiguity protected the patron. It offered the attendant no protection at all. Some of these men left literary traces, poems written to or about them, sometimes tender, sometimes possessive in ways that reveal far more than they conceal. There is a genre of classical Chinese poetry known broadly as Gong Ti palace-style poetry that flourished during the Southern Dynasty's period, roughly the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Much of it describes beautiful young men in the kind of languorous, sensory detail that would not have been out of place in poems about women. The implicit eroticism is unmistakable. And the power differential embedded in these poems is rarely acknowledged by the poet, but it is always there, legible to anyone willing to read beneath the silk. What happened when favor ended? This is the question that haunts the entire history of this institution. Because it almost always ended, emperors died, tastes changed, political fortunes shifted. And when they did, the men who had built their entire existence around a single relationship were left with almost nothing. The lucky ones were simply forgotten. Left to age in some peripheral chamber of a palace district that no longer paid them much attention, given a modest stipend, a title that meant nothing, a room with narrowing walls. They existed, but only barely. They had no skills transferable to the outside world. They had no family connections that still held value. Indeed, their family connections, if they had any, had long since traded whatever goodwill they might have earned on other ambitions. They were stranded. The unlucky ones faced something far worse. A favorite who had accumulated too much power, too much wealth, too much influence during the height of their position became a target the moment that position weakened. Dong Xian, Emperor Ai's beloved, the man for whom a throne had been offered, was forced to commit suicide within hours of the emperor's death. His entire family was destroyed. His wealth was confiscated. The man who had been offered an empire was erased from it within a day. The historical accounts describe this with a kind of grim inevitability, as if his fate was always the only possible conclusion. Perhaps within that world it was. Others were imprisoned. Some were executed on fabricated charges, their former intimacy with the powerful now reframed as manipulation, as corruption, as evidence of dangerous ambition. The very closeness that had once protected them became the accusation that destroyed them. They had been too close. They had known too much. They had existed too visibly in the shadow of power. And so they were removed not just from their positions, but from the historical record, as thoroughly as a name could be erased from a stone. It would be a mistake to look at this history and see only darkness without complexity, because the reality, as with all deeply human histories, resisted simple categories. There were men who found genuine companionship within these arrangements. There were relationships that contained real tenderness, real mutual feeling, even within the scaffolding of profound inequality. The poet and official Mi Ziyuan, who served as a favorite of Duke Ling of Wei in the spring and autumn period, was said to share a peach with his patron, each eating half, in an act of spontaneous intimacy that was later immortalized as Fengtao, the shared peach, another enduring Chinese metaphor for love between men. These metaphors survived because they captured something real. Because human beings, even in the most constrained circumstances, reach toward each other. But tenderness does not undo exploitation. Affection does not retroactively confer freedom. The beauty of the cut sleeve and the shared peach coexisted with systems of surveillance, purchase, physical alteration, and lethal precarity. To honor the humanity of the men who lived inside this world, we must hold both truths simultaneously. The tenderness was real, so was the horror. As we approach the later imperial periods, the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing, the visibility of male favorites in official records becomes increasingly suppressed. Confucian orthodoxy hardened. The discourse around male-male intimacy, once tolerated in literary and courtly contexts, became more explicitly associated with disorder, with moral failure, with the kinds of decadence that brought dynasties to ruin. The very existence of the emperor's male favorites in earlier histories was increasingly treated as evidence of weakness in those emperors, a cautionary tale rather than a lived reality with human beings at its center. The men themselves faded. Their stories stopped being told except as warnings. And so they slipped beneath the surface of the historical record, visible only in fragments, in an elusive poem in a court record that mentions a dismissal without explaining it, in a list of palace staff whose duties are described in language just opaque enough to allow a later reader to look away. They were always there. They were always real. And they always suffered the particular cruelty of being made invisible while still alive. Their existence acknowledged only insofar as it served someone else's purposes, and erased the moment it no longer did. History remembers, even when those who shaped it tried to ensure it would not. Tonight, we gave voice to men who were stripped of theirs, men who lived and suffered and sometimes loved inside a system that treated them as ornaments, as instruments, as expendable. Their names are mostly gone. Their stories are mostly gone. But the shape of their lives remains, pressed into the historical record like a hand pressed into wet clay, faint, partial, undeniable. This is Grimoryx, where the darkness is documented, where what was buried is brought back into the light, not to shock, but because the truth of how human beings have treated one another is the most important story we can tell. If you haven't already, subscribe to Grimoryx. Join us for every story that history tried to leave behind. Hit like if this unsettled you, if it made you think, if it made you feel the weight of lives long past. Drop a comment below, tell us which part of this history struck you deepest. And share this video with those who are ready to face what the textbooks left out. The shadows are full of stories. We'll be here finding them.